So, Chapter 11, Creating a Network, the last chapter in the book and the last presentation set for the course. We're going to talk about network policies and best practices and the difference between a policy and a procedure, how to plan and install a network and maintain, expand, and upgrade a networks. And all those are important. Planning is a big deal in these things. A lot of networks just happened. And when they just happen, that's when we create the bottlenecks, and we don't have the good data flow that we want to have. We don't have maybe the permissions managements that we would like to have. Lots of things about that. In the first module, distinguish between policies, procedures, and best practices. Common policies and best practices for network management and business agreements and regulatory requirements. These are the agreements that businesses make with each other. Service level agreement, to where an ISP is going to give you those 5 nines. We were down, 5.5 minutes a year, and not the 99 where we're down a day and a half a year. So some definitions, and these are, again, we've seen some of these before, but maybe a refresher here. Onboarding. When one organization needs to work directly with another in either vendor or partner relationships, steps should be taken to ensure that the integration process maintains the security of each party's network. This process is known as onboarding. Offboarding, the relationship ends. You need to ensure that all of the doors that were open between the organizations are closed. And when we talked about onboarding before, it was about onboarding mobile devices and offboarding mobile devices. But this one is bringing a partner on board. Security policy, the overall security outlook for an organization. A security policy is a high level document. What do we expect? And within the security policy, we're going to have other policies like the acceptable use policy. Whether employees have the rights to use the company property, internet access, computer equipment for personal use. In some cases, even for phones, the company's going to provide you with a phone, and you can only use the company email on the company phone. You can't use your personal, those sorts of things. How much of it can you use? What is the acceptable use? Some places don't allow you to do internet surfing during business hours, or may allow it at specific times. We had an issue with Facebook in the classroom, that students would be playing the games. And a lot of them were nurses, and that's not what you want as a nurse, that while they were learning how to give shots was doing whatever the games were. And I'm not a Facebook guy. But what our acceptable use policy became is they could use it in the library. They could still use it on the network, on the internet. They could get there, but not from the classroom. So what kind of policies are you going to have for those things? What can people do? When can they do it? Authorized access policy documents access control to company resources, specifies who is allowed to access the various systems, who can do different things. Remote access policy defines remote connections, methods that are accepted by the company. Who can we get on from outside of the private network? Privileged user accounts, and I told you the story about the administrator, and yep, that really did happen. He really did wipe out a whole bunch of the server because he was logged on with a privileged account. Gives access to the systems, gives users the ability to access, modify systems, view restricted data, and so on. And you may have different restrictions, different policies for them, and the policy should be, you should only use that account when you're actually doing management functions, because you can do a whole lot of damage with one of those accounts if something happens to it, as in that case, it did happen to him. Change in configuration management provides a structured approach to securing the assets and making process changes. Why do I need to make the change? What change am I asking to be made? Code of ethics, the rules and standards, ethically in various situations, and then human resource policies, formal rules and guidelines that a business puts in place to hire, train, assess, reward people in the company. And they really are the ones that are responsible for the training. The IT people may do the security training, but human resources should be the ones scheduling it for you. Other policies, and then we'll talk a little bit about some more things about policies. But the password policies, the requirements for passwords. What are going to be the requirements? How often do they have to be changed? How many characters do they have to have? Are we going to use complex passwords? A complex password is just simply where we have characters, numbers, and special characters in there. It makes it a little bit harder for somebody to compromise it. Privacy policies, how are they going to treat your private information? How are they going to protect your private information? The PII, personally identifiable information. And, you know, as long as it's not mine, it's not that big a deal. But if somebody steals my Social Security number, it's a really big deal. User management policies, actions that are going to take place when the employee's status changes. Network administrator for an organization needs to be aware of new employees, advancements, transfers, terminated, and you're usually going to be. And when they got ready to terminate somebody, whereas a network administrator, they call up and say, okay, I'm going to call so-and-so into my office at this time. And when that happens, when you see them come to my office, I want you to disable their account so that they can no longer have access to any of the data of the corporation, of the company. So policies, a policy is a statement describing how an organization is to be run from the perspective of management intent. A standard is a definition of specific methodologies, requirements to satisfy the policies. Guidelines, best practices, recommendations. Guidelines are recommendations and procedures, a specific set of ordered instructions. And again, those of you, and a lot of you are veterans, you probably had a lot of those in the jobs that you did. That this is the step-by-step. This is the way we're going to do it. The right way, the wrong way, and the Navy way, you know. So this is it. Maintenance, we had maintenance cards, step-by-step, how we were going to do the maintenance. And that's what a procedure is going to be. Policies, we're going to have them at multiple levels. Managerial and staff, the issues that they're going to address, the legal and regulatory requirements are going to be here, how we're going to handle those. Who has access to what information? That's going to be a managerial type of responsibility. What's necessary to enact the policy. The consequences of non-compliance. A policy without any controls, without any consequences, is not going to be followed. We had one, and I keep saying we had, and you know, we did some things right, we did some things wrong. Policy said, hey, you got to wear your badge while you're in the building. Everybody had a badge. People didn't wear their badge. So what are the consequences? Student, you send a student home, they just don't come back. So what are going to be the consequences for non-compliance? And these are things that you really have to think through. Employees, yeah, you've got a lot of compliance. You've got a lot bigger hammer, I guess, because you can do performance, you can do counseling, notes in their record, and those sorts of things. But how are you going to cause these policies to be followed? And how is it going to be changed? And how is it going to be revised? What's going to be the process? Who's going to be involved in the policy creation as well as the policy change? Who decides that it's a good policy, that it's a working policy, that it's something that we want? The IT staff, guidelines and best practices for security goals. The technological standards are going to come from here. Documents for specific configurations and management tests, specific configurations on the hardware configurations. User permissions, user policies, and policies are things like when can a user log on, what time of day, can they log on 24 hours a day, can they only log on during working hours, what can they do? How are we going to dispose of the data disposal policies. Written data, digital data. How do you get rid of hard drives? What policies, what procedures are you going to follow to destroy this equipment? How are you going to get rid of disks? Are you going to get rid of tapes? All of those things, the data disposal, so that we're not a victim of dumpster diving. So we have the acceptable use policy. Acceptable use is how can users use the resources of the company. Incident response, the steps, and we just talked about the incident response and disaster planning. Change management, how we're going to update policies and update other things within the organization. Change management, how are we going to change the applications that are on the machine? We're going to have a process for people to recommend changes or request changes when we do there. Standard operating procedures, step-by-step instructions for routine tasks that we're going to use. Acceptable use, technical controls can limit the harm that people can do. The limit access, the policies that we have, when can they log on, the permissions that they have, those kinds of things. And what I was thinking was, we talked about, I think the Swiss stock trader that lost several $1 billion, and then he covered it up. The way he covered it up is he came in on weekends. And falsified trades to cover up the losses that he had. If the company had a policy that, yep, these guys can only do this stuff during working hours on the premises, probably wouldn't have had the ability to do the covering up. So the access permissions, what are we going to do? When are we going to allow them to do it? Need to specify how the company resources may be used. And I think that you can kind of imagine a lot of things there. Can you use the internet? What can you use the internet for? Anytime. Can you use the company email for personal purposes? Can you use the phone that the company issued to you to check your private email? Do you have to have two phones? Those sorts of arrangements is how the company resources are going to be used. And again, here you got to have consequences. These are not just suggestions, these are policies. If you don't have consequences, then having seen that, people aren't going to follow them if it's inconvenient. The users sign, read, and understand, and you need to show what the user agreed to, because if you get to the point that you need to terminate them, you've got to show that they knew what they were responsible for doing, that they were doing something that was wrong. The internet could prohibit personal use, and I think we probably have mentioned a lot of these things all along. May be allowed with restrictions. Company accounts, email and social networking accounts. And the social networking accounts are getting to be a bigger and bigger and bigger deal. The Facebooks and the Twitter accounts that people are using, that somebody's appointed to do it, what's authorized, what's not authorized, who can speak for the company, and generally going to say you can't speak for the company, only this person can't speak for the company, so don't do it, because that's one of the acceptable use policies, the things that we're not allowed to do. Hardware and software that they may have access to, and the changes that the users are allowed to make. And a lot of times it's that you're not allowed to make any changes to the corporate equipment. If changes are going to be made, IT is going to make them. Why is IT going to make them? Because they've got a better feel, at least, for what's going on, what the impacts may be of the changes. And they're not going to, we hope at least, not going to go and get a bunch of viruses on the devices. Privacy policy, what's recorded, how is it shared, will it be shared, will we sell your information, will we share your information with anybody else? And that is getting to be a bigger and bigger and bigger deal, because it looks like that the privacy just doesn't exist even if you don't have a lot of these accounts. Privileged users, these are the guys with higher access, acceptable use, they do pose an additional risk, and only to administrators when you should use these accounts. And talked about that a little bit earlier and why. And yeah, you can do a lot of damage if you're logged on routinely with your administrator account. Prohibit privilege access for the routine, additional monitoring and review for these users because of the additional access that they do have. Other responsibilities for the privileged users, training, and then again we have to have penalties for non-compliance for all of these. And I'll leave it at, yeah, it's dangerous. Passwords, that is what we're always trying to get, or somebody's always trying to get, trying to find our password, trying to crack our password, or crack somebody's password, or get you to send the password. And I told you the story about the administrator, and that was one. Yes, it really did happen. Got an email, we're here from IT, and we're here to help, and we need your username and password, and they sent it. That passwords are prime targets, particularly people that have a lot of authority or a lot of privilege in the corporation. Some more significant than others. The director, probably better. You know, the guy that just got hired yesterday. It's important, but it's not as important as maybe I can get the IT administrator's password, or I can get the director's password, or I can get an executive assistant's password. How many passwords do you have? And you think about it. I think about it all the time. There must be 100 of them or more that everybody has. And how are you going to manage them? I use a piece of software. Generally, now it's pretty well concluded that you're probably going to write them down, but you need to write them down and keep them in a secure place when you do those things, because we need a different password for each system. If we don't, one compromised password compromises a whole lot of resources, and they sell them, and I've gotten them and said, you know, send me money, and here's the username and the password, and they're pretty old passwords, but that's why you do need to change them, because they're being sold on a regular basis. Configure the failed login attempts. How many can you fail before the system gets shut down and just says no, and you've got to go to the administrator and say, okay, I messed up. I need you to reset my account so I can log on. Don't use words with dictionary attacks or pretty quick, slangs or acronyms. Anything that could show up in a dictionary attack, you really don't want a password, because they are quick. You can do a dictionary attack with a whole bunch of words in it, probably about 5 to 10 minutes. Change the passwords often, and then use a rotation for those things. Policies should be easier. Yeah, and then this is okay. Easy for users to remember, but difficult for an attacker to guess. Don't use your dog's name or your wife's birthday, those sorts of things. Should never be shared between users, and they shouldn't be written down on a sticky note and taped onto the monitor, or slid under the calendar, or put into the top drawer of the desk. And I found passwords in all of those places. If it's got to be stored anywhere but in the owner's memory, should be kept secure. And this is, yeah, you probably can write it down, but you don't want to lose control of it, and you don't want to display it to the world. Should be changed if there's any reason that it's been compromised. And lately that means changing it really frequently, because so many databases have been compromised lately, and it's tough to keep up with them. Hopefully you get the notifications when those things happen. Passwords are a single factor, easily compromised. Secure accounts you have multi-factor authentication, single sign-on. Effective solution to users struggling with multiple separate passwords. Single sign-on is great, but single sign-on also means a single compromise. Mobile devices that we have apply a consistent policy. It's easier when it's company owned, and I think we talked about that a little earlier. If it's your device, the company can't really tell you what to do with it. They can't tell you to put an antivirus on it. They can't tell you how to manage it. If it's company owned, yep, we can do that. So there are some other methods that companies are kind of going to. The corporate owned, business only. That means you can't do anything private on the device itself. You can't check your email. You can't have your own apps. Basically means you're going to have two phones. BYOD, bring your own device, easy to deploy, and the difficult security. How does the corporation enforce security on a personal device? You know, if you think about it, probably to the advantage of the individual to have that security, because you're going to get better protection from that. Corporate owned, personally enabled, the corporate device, and you can use it personally. Then to choose your own device, a list of approved devices. And the reason there is each of the devices, the manufacturers and the versions, are going to have different requirements for the management, the security management of them. And if you have a list of them that you got the software that you need to manage it with, it makes it obviously a lot easier to do that. If you only have to know how to manage 10 or 15 instead of 200 of them, it's a whole lot different situation. The user's own, but you can use it on the corporate network. You choose your own device, and these are going to be the types of devices that the corporation would allow on the network. So, mobile devices, a security baseline for these things, the onboarding procedures, join the network, offboarding, remove it from the network. Who supports the device? If it's a personal device, does IT support it? How much does IT support it? Does IT, what do they do? Who owns what data? And this is one on the personal devices that they kind of gone to dividing the storage area, that this little area is for corporate and this area is yours. You can do whatever you want to with it. How are you going to prevent IP theft, exfiltration of the data? Acceptable use policy, policies differ for the mobile, may differ for the mobile. We're going to have the mobile disable configured on these things so that if they get lost. Offboarding, and we talk onboarding is when we bring it on, and that's just putting it on the network and doing the things that we talked about, the security. How are we going to configure it? But offboarding, when it leaves the network, reset, disable the VPNs, disable any domain trust relationships, disable the user or group accounts, and then reset the passwords that were available for this thing. Acceptable remote connections to the enterprise, the remote access policy. How are we going to connect remotely to the network? What are we going to allow? Requirements for remote systems that can be joined to the network. This is the network access control that we have. Check to be sure that you've got an antivirus. Check to be sure that your Windows updates are up to date. Those kinds of things before they can join the network. The location restrictions for external access. You don't want people probably connecting to the network and looking at the secure database at a Starbucks. So where can they review it from? And this is one of those that we talked about. What the location, if you can, and Starbucks you couldn't do that, but what locations can you get onto the network from? But you're going to have restrictions. What can you do so that we don't get shoulder surfing for our sensitive information? And additional restrictions can be applied to all of the remote access. A couple of things to think about. If you walk away, how long is the connection going to last before it actually times out? The one I told you about, the individual that they hired in Texas had a teenage son. Would they then be able to maybe get onto the network? How are you going to do these things? What kind of restrictions are you going to have on the remote devices? If it's company owned, it's a whole lot easier than if it's personally owned, because again, personally owned things we can't dictate what users do with their own personal devices. Human resource policies. Hiring, obviously, is what they do. Qualified, trustworthy, do background security checks of the individuals that are being hired. Training, orientation, ongoing education. Security, they're supposed to oversee and track, even security, they're supposed to oversee and track all of the training that goes on with the users. And they're responsible for the orientation that you get when you get hired. Enforcement, including the security concerns, security concerns in the evaluation. And if it's a termination, ensure that the security credentials are revoked, and the security credentials are revoked, and the network, the accounts are going to be disabled, and all sorts of stuff. And you've probably seen this. And when they do that, after the account gets disabled and all that, they march you back to your desk with a box, and you put all your personal stuff in, and then they walk you out the door. Ethics, leadership role, should have a leadership role in the code of ethics, and the acceptable behavior is going to be part of that. Asset management and control, networks, everything, and all the IT assets, everything's got a value of some kind. How are we going to get rid of these things? We had a company one time that gave us like 100 machines, 100 computers, but it took all the hard drives out. Rightfully so. They didn't want to give away any of their data. But when we do these things, may be a threat vector. And the same token, I bought a used laptop one time, and I did one of these get data back just for the heck of it, just see if there's anything there. And there was data there that was recoverable had I been interested in it. So how are you going to get rid of this stuff? It's all got value. You may want to resell it, may want to donate it, but you need to secure it before you do those things. Tracked and secured, the device is tracked and secured through the entire lifetime. Disposal, how do we get rid of it? Physically destroy, we can shred the paper. Hard drives, there are hard drive shredders. Usually drilling a hole in the hard drive is going to do that, particularly if you drill holes through the platters also. Some information has a minimum retention specification, so that goes back to the don't get rid of something that you need, or don't get rid of something that you're legally required to retain. Security and safety, building layout, the security areas, the fire escapes, the doors, do they fail close, or the locks actually, do they fail close or do they fail open? And fail closes, they fail in the lock position, and fail open, they fail in the unlocked position. Alarmed one-way emergency door, somebody goes out of it. Do you have alert systems? Do you have emergency drills? And in some places, some environments you're required to do those. Schools, for instance, I think are required, or at least in Virginia, they're required to have fire drills, and the fire marshal had to come and observe it to be sure that you know how to get all of the students out of the buildings and out of the buildings. Regulatory compliance, this is some of the you gotta comply from. These are the new regulations, and the reason we have all of these regulations is because somebody's done something to deserve this, I guess. Somebody's done something to trigger the things that go on, but we have the federal agencies are regulated by the Federal Information Security Management Act, FISMA. Sarbanes-Oxley, corporate financial data, and this is that the CEO's got to sign it. Health patient or patient data, HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. Now you know why we call it HIPAA. Payment cards, credit cards, the payment card industry security standard. Maybe additional laws, and we have additional personally identifiable PII controls set up so that we don't reveal those, and we see that they're getting revealed inadvertently on fairly regular basis. International controls, what technologies can be exported, and there are a number of encryption technologies that still can't be exported. If you look at if you do a Cisco course and you look at when it starts up, a lot of the operating system, some of the operating systems at least, say that they're not exportable. So are they? Are they not? Trade sanctions, what goes on, special foreign countries. North Korea, you're probably not, in Cuba, you're probably not going to be able to send anything. So what are the restrictions with each of the companies? The business agreements, and this is the last slide before the questions. The service level agreement, I think we've mentioned it before, is a formal service definition. This is the ISP when they explicitly lay out in a legally binding contract the services that they will provide for you. And this includes the uptime, things like that. What's going to be the data rate? What's going to be the throughput? Or what's going to be the uptime for these things? What's going to happen if this, what's going to be the result of this happens, and on down the line. So we have the service level agreement, the master service agreement between two parties, general interactions like intellectual property were going to be used for these things. So it's agreement to develop a relationship. Statement of work, the work agreement, liabilities and responsibilities, what work is going to be done. Memorandum of understanding, the less formal agreement, kind of some mutual goals. It's kind of one of the first steps. We have a memorandum of understanding, and then we'll work out the details. What are we going to do? How are we going to share? What are we going to share? Who's going to do what for each other? And then the non-disclosure agreement is a legal agreement to protect proprietary and confidential information so that you don't get hired by a competitor and take all of the entire user base with you, for instance. So those are the overview of a number of the policies